united with Christ, our efforts and His efforts, His supernatural empowering, they all merge into one. I know we looked at these 2 verses last week, but they are so pivotal for our understanding of this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and His grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them. You hear the focus, you hear the paying close attention to what you hear. You hear the inclining your heart. You hear the seeking after it like a hidden treasure. I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is within me. Okay? So you see this merging together of these two. So there's a brother in Christ by the name of Dane Ortland that has really helped me to grasp this in, I think, a more complete and more accurate biblical way. So think of this as, if we think about our post-conversion life, think about your post-conversion life. The life that begins at conversion, and then that life that is then this striving towards godliness, this sanctification. Think of that as a circle. And picture in your mind a circle. And your post-conversion life is represented by what's inside this circle. What's inside the circle is your post-conversion life of how you pursue godliness in a real way. All right, so what you put inside the circle determines how you consider, how you understand that post-conversion holiness or godliness is how you are working to achieve that. So inside the circle, we might put, the first thing that we might put might be me. M-E. And that would represent the idea that salvation is of God, it's His work, but once I'm saved, then that's when I get to work. And I think everybody in the room would immediately recognize that that's just terribly unbiblical. That upon salvation, it's not like God says, okay, there, I've given you forgiveness and pardon, good luck. God doesn't say that. I think we all recognize that. So that one we would discard it immediately. The me goes away. But then the correction of that might sort of overshoot the target. And inside the circle, we might, instead of putting me, we might put God. To say, salvation is all of God. And then after salvation, it's still all of God. From that came, if you remember back in the 90s, you remember that whole let go, let God thing? That sort of came out of that. It's all God. And just stop. Just stop. It's all God. Right? So you take the me out and you put God in, and somehow you sense that you're closer to the biblical reality, but that still doesn't square with the Scriptures at all, particularly Scriptures like 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. So then you might erase out the God and you might try once again. The third try, again, you picture the circle, and imagine that you take your marker and you draw this sort of squiggly line down through the circle, separating it into sort of two sort of squiggly halves. And on one half, you would put God. And on the other half, you'd put me. And that would represent this convergence, this coming together, this God coming together with me. And the two, we combine our efforts. And together, we pursue godliness. I can't do it alone. And God won't do it without me. And so it's this coming together. And we might sense that, I'm obviously getting much closer to the biblical picture. But this is where Ortland really helped me to see we're still not there. Because our post-Christian life is not this. Instead, our post-Christian life is the circle with both God and me written inside. In such a way, picture it like this. My efforts, Paul, I worked harder than anyone. And along comes the Spirit. And like with the wings of an eagle, takes what I give, and it's me. It won't happen without I, Paul, worked harder than any of them. But it was not me. It was the Spirit. And so underneath comes the Spirit. And together, this is the union of Christ. This is Christ and me, one. This is what Paul says to the Galatians. I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer Paul. But Paul is now united together with Christ. This is the full picture of post-conversion life. This is the full picture of union with Christ. God will not honor laziness. God will not honor spiritual sluggardness. But He will come along with His empowering, spiritual multiplication, and like the wings of an eagle, take our efforts and raise them to spiritual heights. And that's what Jesus is saying here. For with the measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And much more will be added. It's not a one-to-one correlation. It's not a one in, one out, two in, two out. This is the union of the believer with Jesus Christ in such a way that our efforts are then greatly multiplied many times over. God has determined that the pathway to knowing Him is the pathway of diligent attention to what He has said to us. So that's a good way to think of this, I think. That God has determined that the pathway to knowing Him, or the place of knowing Him, think of it like that. Like the location in which this blessing, the blessing of knowing God, Paul says to the Philippians, that I might know Him in the power of His resurrection, that the location of knowing Him is the location of the diligent attention to what He has said to us.